I was standing in my backyard in Naperville, Illinois, admiring the 3 raised garden beds I just finished installing when I saw Patricia Whitmore marching across my lawn with that look on her face. You know the one. The look that says she's about to ruin your entire week because something has offended her delicate sensibilities. My name is Gary Jenkins, and I'd lived in the Oakwood Meadows subdivision for exactly 7 months. Long enough to know that Patricia, our HOA president, had made it her personal mission to find something wrong with every single thing I did. "Mr. Jenkins," she called out, her voice shrill enough to send the robins flying from my oak tree. "We need to talk about these monstrosities you've constructed." I turned around, keeping my expression neutral. I'd learned that showing any emotion with Patricia was like throwing gasoline on a fire. "Good morning, Patricia. What seems to be the problem?" She stopped about 5 feet from my garden beds, hands on her hips, her perfectly pressed khaki capris and white blouse making her look like she was auditioning for a lifestyle magazine about suburban tyranny. The problem is that these things are an eyesore. They're way too high. The HOA covenant clearly states that any outdoor structures must maintain aesthetic harmony with the neighborhood. I took a deep breath. I'd anticipated this conversation, which is why I'd done my homework. "Actually, Patricia, these garden beds are exactly 30 inches high, which is the height recommended by ADA guidelines for accessible gardening." Her face flushed red. "ADA? What does that have to do with anything? The Americans with Disabilities Act." "I have a documented disability, a back condition from my service in the Army. My doctor recommended raised beds at this specific height so I can garden without bending over and aggravating my spine injuries." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "That's convenient. And I suppose you have documentation for all of this." "I do, actually. Would you like to see it?" She waved her hand dismissively. "That won't be necessary right now, but I'm calling an emergency HOA board meeting about this. These beds are too high, disability or not. They block the sight line from the street, and they're made of that ugly cedar wood that doesn't match anything else in the neighborhood." I gestured to my neighbor's yard. "Tom has cedar fencing. The Hendersons 3 houses down have cedar deck furniture. And as for sight lines, these beds are in my backyard, Patricia. They're not visible from the street at all unless someone comes onto my property." "We'll see what the board has to say about this," she snapped, spinning on her heel and marching back toward her house across the street. I looked down at my raised beds with their rich soil, ready for planting tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. After everything I'd been through with my back, after the 2 surgeries and months of physical therapy, I'd finally found something that would let me garden again without pain. And Patricia Whitmore was not going to take that away from me. That evening, I got an email from the HOA. The subject line read, "Violation Notice, Unauthorized Structure Installation." I opened it with a sense of dread that was becoming all too familiar. "Dear Mr. Jenkins, it has come to the attention of the Oakwood Meadows HOA board that you have installed 3 raised garden bed structures in your backyard without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Additionally, these structures exceed the maximum height allowance of 18 inches for any landscaping feature. You are hereby ordered to remove these structures within 14 days or face daily fines of $50 per day until compliance is achieved. Sincerely, Patricia Whitmore, HOA President." I read the email 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each pass. 18 inches. I'd read through the entire HOA covenant before buying the house, and I'd never seen any mention of an 18-inch height restriction for landscaping features. I pulled out my copy of the covenant and searched through it again. Nothing. Absolutely nothing about 18 inches. The next morning, I called my real estate lawyer, Monica Chen, who'd helped me close on the house. Monica, I need your help. The HOA is coming after me for my garden beds. After I explained the situation, Monica sighed. Let me guess, Patricia Whitmore. How'd you know? Because she's done this to at least 5 other homeowners I know of. She's a piece of work. Send me everything you have. The violation notice, your medical documentation about your back condition, photos of the garden beds, and your copy of the HOA covenant. I'll review it and get back to you. I spent the rest of the day gathering documents. My VA medical records showing my service-connected disability rating for my back. The letter from my orthopedic surgeon recommending raised bed gardening at 30 inches. Photos of my garden beds from multiple angles. Measurements. Even receipts showing what I'd spent on materials. 2 days later, Monica called me back. Gary, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that there's nothing in your HOA covenant about an 18-inch height restriction for landscaping. Patricia literally made that up. The bad news is that the covenant does require architectural approval for any permanent outdoor structures. But these aren't permanent, I protested. They're just boxes sitting on the ground. I didn't attach them to anything. That might work in your favor, but here's the thing. Even if they were permanent, the Fair Housing Act and ADA regulations supersede HOA covenants when it comes to reasonable accommodations for disabilities. Your garden beds are a clear, reasonable accommodation. The 30-inch height isn't arbitrary. It's the standard accessibility height. So what do I do? Write a formal response to the HOA. Cite the Fair Housing Act and ADA. Include your medical documentation. Request a reasonable accommodation hearing. I'll help you draft it. And Gary, don't remove those garden beds, not 1 inch. We spent an hour on the phone crafting the response. Monica was thorough, citing specific sections of federal law and case precedent. We included everything: my service record, my medical documentation, even studies about accessible gardening and the therapeutic benefits for veterans with disabilities. I sent the response via certified mail and email. Then I waited. 3 days passed before I got a response. Another email from Patricia, this time even more aggressive. Mr. Jenkins, your claim of needing a reasonable accommodation does not override the aesthetic standards of this community. The board has voted unanimously to uphold the violation notice. You now have 11 days to remove the structures or face fines. We will not be bullied by threats of litigation. I called Monica immediately. They're not backing down. Of course they're not. Patricia Whitmore doesn't back down. She doubles down. But she's also digging herself and the HOA into a very deep legal hole. Let them start assessing fines. Document everything. Keep copies of all communications. And in the meantime, I'm going to do some research on Patricia and this HOA board. The next week crawled by. I planted my garden beds anyway. Tomatoes, bell peppers, jalapenos, basil, cilantro, and parsley. Every morning I went out there and tended to my plants, feeling the satisfaction of being able to garden without the shooting pain down my legs that used to leave me bedridden for days. Patricia drove by at least twice a day, slowing down dramatically each time to glare at my property. On the 8th day, I received another certified letter, notice of fine assessment. They were charging me $50 per day starting from the original violation date. Monica's response was immediate. Perfect. They've just given us everything we need for a lawsuit. They're discriminating against you based on your disability, and they're doing it in writing. I really don't want to sue my HOA, I said. I just want to garden in peace. I understand, But sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to stand up to them. Let me send them one more letter. A formal demand letter explaining exactly what laws they're breaking and what will happen if they don't immediately rescind these fines and grant your accommodation request. Monica's demand letter was a thing of beauty. 6 pages of legal citations, case law, and a detailed explanation of how the HOA was violating federal law. She sent copies to every board member, not just Patricia. 2 days later, I got a phone call from an unknown number. "Mr. Jenkins, this is Robert Fitzgerald. I'm on the HOA board. Listen, I just got a letter from your lawyer, and I had no idea about the ADA issue or your medical situation. Patricia told us you were just being difficult about following the rules." "She did she?" "Yeah. Look, I'm a contractor. I work with ADA compliance all the time. Your garden beds are textbook reasonable accommodation. I'm calling an emergency board meeting and I'm going to motion to rescind the violation and fines. But I need to ask, do you have that medical documentation your lawyer mentioned?" "I do. I can provide it to the full board." "Good. Meetings tomorrow night at 7. The community center. I'd appreciate if you'd come and bring those documents." I showed up to the community center the next evening with a folder full of documentation and Monica on speakerphone in my pocket, just in case I needed backup. The board consisted of 5 people: Patricia, Robert Fitzgerald, 2 women I'd seen around the neighborhood named Susan Miller and Jennifer Torres, and an older gentleman named Frank Peterson. Patricia's face was already red when I walked in. "Mr. Jenkins, let's make this quick." Robert cut her off. "Patricia, let's follow proper procedure. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for coming. I've asked for this meeting because I believe we may have made an error in our violation notice. Could you please explain your situation for the full board?" I laid out everything. My military service, my back injuries from a training accident and later from combat deployments, the surgeries, the ongoing pain, how my doctor had recommended gardening as physical therapy, but that traditional ground-level gardening was impossible for me. How raised beds at 30 inches, the ADA standard height, allowed me to garden without bending. Jennifer Torres was nodding along. My father has back problems too. He has a raised bed, but I never knew there was a specific height recommendation. Patricia interrupted. "This is all very touching, but the rules are the rules. We can't just make exceptions because someone has a sad story." Frank Peterson, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up in a gravelly voice. "Patricia, with all due respect, we're not talking about making an exception. We're talking about federal law. I'm a retired federal judge. I've been sitting here listening to Mr. Jenkins, and I've been reviewing the letter from his attorney. If we proceed with these fines and force him to remove those garden beds, we will lose a lawsuit. Badly. And it will cost this HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and damages." Patricia's face went from red to purple. "This is ridiculous. Next thing you know, everyone will claim they need some kind of accommodation." "That's not how it works," Robert said. "You need actual documentation. Gary has provided that. I motion that we immediately rescind the violation notice and all associated fines, and that we approve his raised garden beds as a reasonable accommodation under the Fair Housing Act." "I second," Frank said immediately. "All in favor?" Robert asked. Robert, Frank, Jennifer, and Susan all raised their hands. Patricia sat with her arms crossed, refusing to vote. "Motion passes 4-0 with 1 abstention," Robert said. "Gary, we apologize for this situation. Your garden beds are approved. We'll send you a formal letter within 48 hours. I stood to leave, feeling a sense of relief, but Patricia wasn't done. "This isn't over. There are other violations on your property. The grass in your front lawn is a 1/4 inch too long. Your mailbox has a small dent. Your garbage cans were visible from the street last Tuesday. Robert's jaw dropped. Patricia, what are you doing? I'm doing my job as HOA president, making sure our neighborhood standards are maintained. I'd had enough. No, Patricia, you're harassing me because I stood up to you. And now you're retaliating, which is also illegal. Frank cleared his throat. Gary's right. Patricia, what you're describing is clear retaliation for Mr. Jenkins asserting his legal rights. That's a separate cause of action under the Fair Housing Act. I strongly suggest you stop talking right now. I left the meeting feeling vindicated but also uneasy. I'd won the battle, but Patricia's parting shots made it clear the war wasn't over. Over the next week, I received 3 more violation notices. One for my grass being too long, which I measured and found to be exactly 1 3/4 inches, well within the 2-inch maximum stated in the covenant. One for my mailbox, which had a tiny dent from the previous owner's time. And one claiming my house number wasn't clearly visible from the street, even though it absolutely was. Each violation came with a threat of fines. Each one was petty and either false or so minor as to be laughable. I documented everything and sent it all to Monica. She's insane, Monica said when I called her. This is textbook retaliation, but here's what we're going to do. I'm going to file a formal complaint with HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They handle Fair Housing Act violations. And I'm going to prepare a lawsuit not just against the HOA, but personally against Patricia for harassment and retaliation. Can we do that? Sue her personally? Absolutely. When HOA board members act outside the scope of their authority or violate federal law, they can lose their personal liability protections. And Gary, she's way outside her authority here. The HUD complaint went in on a Monday. By Wednesday, I'd received a call from a HUD investigator named James Walker. Mr. Jenkins, I've reviewed your complaint. I'm going to be honest with you. This is one of the more clear-cut cases of disability discrimination and retaliation I've seen. Can you meet with me this Friday? I'll need to inspect your property and interview you in detail. Friday afternoon, James Walker showed up in a government vehicle. He was a tall black man in his 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of my old drill sergeants. He spent 2 hours at my house. He measured my garden beds, photographed them from every angle, reviewed all my documentation, measured my grass, examined my mailbox, took pictures of my clearly visible house numbers. Mr. Jenkins, I'm also going to need to interview your HOA board. Do you happen to know when they meet next? They have a regular meeting next Tuesday. Perfect. I'll be there. I wasn't invited to the Tuesday meeting, but Robert called me that night. Gary, you should have been there. This HUD investigator showed up and absolutely grilled Patricia for an hour. She tried to defend all those violation notices she sent you, but he just kept asking her about the timing, about how you'd never received any violations before the garden bed dispute, about how she sent you 3 violations in 1 week right after you asserted your rights under the Fair Housing Act. She kept digging herself deeper. What did the rest of the board do? Susan and Jennifer looked horrified. Frank kept shaking his head, and I told the investigator that most of the board hadn't even seen those violation notices before Patricia sent them. She's been acting unilaterally, using the HOA president title to harass you personally. What happens now? Well, the HUD guy said he's going to file a recommendation for a formal investigation. But also, Gary, we called a vote after he left. Patricia's been removed as HOA president. We voted her out 4-1. She only voted for herself. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Seriously, seriously. She's still on the board, unfortunately, because removing someone completely requires a vote of the entire community, not just the board. But she has no authority anymore. Jennifer is taking over as president, and her first action was to formally rescind every violation notice Patricia sent you and to send you a written apology on behalf of the HOA. Things were quiet for about 2 weeks. My tomatoes started flowering. The peppers grew bushy and strong. Every morning I spent a half hour tending my garden, feeling grateful for these beds that let me enjoy something I'd thought was lost to me forever. Then I came home from grocery shopping one Saturday afternoon to find all 3 of my garden beds destroyed. The wood was cracked and splintered. The soil was scattered across my lawn. My plants were ripped up and thrown everywhere. And spray painted on my back fence in red paint were the words, "No exceptions." I stood there in shock for a solid minute before I called 911. The Naperville Police Department sent 2 officers, Martinez and Thompson. They took one look at the destruction and called for a detective. Detective Sarah Hunt arrived within 30 minutes. She was a short woman with sharp eyes that took in every detail. "Mr. Jenkins, talk me through what happened here." I explained everything. The HOA dispute, Patricia, the violation notices, the retaliation, the HUD complaint, Patricia being removed as president. And you think Patricia Whitmore did this? I don't know. But that message sure seems like someone who's angry about accommodations. Detective Hunt photographed everything. The destroyed garden beds, the spray paint. She collected samples of the red paint. She had the officers canvass the neighborhood to see if anyone had seen anything. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm going to be honest. This is criminal damage to property, possibly a hate crime given the disability angle, and we're going to investigate it thoroughly. But without witnesses or video evidence, it might be hard to prove who did this. I understand. Do you have any security cameras?" "No. I've been meaning to install some, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. I'd recommend doing that as soon as possible. In the meantime, we'll follow up on some leads." After the police left, I sat on my back porch and looked at the destruction. Not just the money I'd spent on materials, not just the time I'd invested in building and planting, but the violation of my space, the maliciousness of it, the deliberate cruelty. My phone rang. It was Robert. "Gary, I just heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Listen, some of us neighbors are coming over tomorrow to help you rebuild. We're not letting this stand. You don't have to do that." "Yes, we do. This is wrong. What happened to you is wrong, and whoever did this doesn't represent our neighborhood." The next morning, 6 of my neighbors showed up with tools and materials. Robert brought extra lumber. Tom from next door brought fresh soil. Jennifer Torres brought plant starts from her own garden. Even Frank Peterson showed up, too old for heavy lifting but supervising and offering advice. We rebuilt those garden beds in 4 hours, stronger than before, better than before. And this time, Tom installed motion-activated security cameras covering my entire backyard. "I had extras from a job," he said. "Consider it a gift. But also, if whoever did this comes back, we'll have them on camera." Detective Hunt called me 2 days later. "Mr. Jenkins, can you come down to the station? I have some developments in your case." At the police station, Detective Hunt led me to an interview room. "We've been investigating, and we found something interesting. Your neighbor across the street, Mrs. Davidson, has security cameras. Her cameras caught a vehicle parking on the street near your house the night of the vandalism. We pulled the footage and identified the vehicle as belonging to Patricia Whitmore." My heart started pounding. So it was her. "The footage shows her vehicle there at the time, but we can't see the driver. We need more evidence. However, we did a little more digging." We pulled Patricia's social media accounts. Did you know she's been posting on several HOA Facebook groups? No. Detective Hunt turned her laptop around. I saw screenshots of Facebook posts. Patricia had been on forums complaining about me. Some of the posts were relatively benign, venting about homeowners who abuse disability claims to get special treatment. But others were darker. If people won't follow the rules, maybe they need to learn the hard way. And sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands when the system fails. These posts are concerning, Detective Hunt said, but they're still not direct evidence. However, we did execute a search warrant on her home this morning. We found a can of red spray paint in her garage that matches the paint used on your fence. We've arrested Patricia Whitmore for criminal damage to property and vandalism. I sat back in my chair processing this. What happens now? Now we build a case. The paint is being analyzed. We're looking at her phone records to see if she was in the area at the time. The social media posts establish a pattern of animosity. Combined with everything else, the documented HOA dispute, her removal as president, we think we have a strong case. But I need to ask you, would you be willing to testify if this goes to trial? Absolutely. Patricia was released on bond that evening. The next morning, I received a certified letter, not from the HOA, but from Patricia personally. It was a rambling, 6-page letter claiming she was being persecuted, that I had destroyed the neighborhood, that she'd done nothing wrong and the police were harassing her because I'd weaponized my disability. I forwarded it to both Detective Hunt and Monica. Monica called immediately. Gary, she's completely unhinged. This letter is practically a confession. She's admitting to being at your house to check on your garden beds. That places her at the scene. What do? Nothing. Let the criminal case proceed, but I'm also going to file that civil lawsuit now. Against both Patricia personally and the HOA for failing to properly supervise their board member and allowing the harassment to continue. The lawsuit was filed the next week. We sued for damages to my property, emotional distress, violations of the Fair Housing Act, and attorney's fees. The dollar amount was substantial, $75,000. The neighborhood response was swift and surprising. A petition started circulating to remove Patricia from the HOA board entirely and to recall her membership in the community association. Within a week, over 80% of homeowners had signed it. Jennifer Torres called me. Gary, we're having a special community meeting next week to vote on Patricia's removal. The board supports it unanimously, but we'd like you to speak about what happened if you're comfortable with that. The community center was packed the night of the meeting. Nearly every household in Oakwood Meadows sent a representative. Patricia sat in the front row with her husband, a meek-looking man who seemed to be trying to disappear into his chair. Jennifer opened the meeting. Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss and vote on the removal of Patricia Whitmore from the HOA board and her expulsion from the Community Association board. Gary Jenkins has agreed to speak about the events that led to this vote. I stood and walked to the front. Public speaking had never been my strong suit, but I'd learned in the Army that sometimes you just have to push through. Most of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm Gary Jenkins. I moved here 7 months ago. I'm a disabled veteran with a service-connected back injury. Earlier this year, I installed 3 raised garden beds in my backyard so I could garden without pain. These beds are built to ADA accessibility standards at 30 inches high, the recommended height for people who can't bend safely. I went on to describe everything that had happened. The initial violation notice, Patricia's refusal to accept medical documentation, the retaliation violations, the HUD complaint, her removal as president, And finally, the destruction of my garden beds. I want to be clear, I said. Most of my neighbors have been wonderful. People like Robert, Tom, Jennifer, they came together to help me rebuild. But Patricia's actions have been harmful not just to me, but to this entire community. She's cost the HOA money in legal fees. She's exposed the association to significant liability. And she's created an environment where people are afraid to make reasonable modifications to their own properties. When I finished, there was applause. Patricia stood up, her face bright red. This is a witch hunt. I have served this community for 8 years. I have maintained our standards and our property values, and this is how you repay me. By believing this man who's barely lived here and who's using his so-called disability to break our rules. Frank Peterson stood up. Patricia, sit down. Mr. Jenkins isn't using anything. He has legitimate medical documentation, and you destroyed his property. You're facing criminal charges. That hasn't been proven. You literally admitted in a letter to being at his house, Jennifer said quietly. Patricia, you need legal counsel and you need to stop talking. The vote was called. Of the 83 households represented, 80 voted to remove Patricia from the board and expel her from any leadership positions. 2 voted against it. Patricia and her husband. Patricia stood, grabbed her purse and stormed out, her husband hurrying behind her. As she passed me, she hissed, "This isn't over." But it was over for her. The criminal case proceeded quickly. The pain analysis came back as a match. Cell phone tower data placed Patricia's phone at my address during the time of the vandalism. And most damning, during a police interview, she'd made statements that contradicted her earlier claims about her whereabouts that night. Her defense attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal. Monica, who was staying informed through the prosecutor's office at my request, kept me updated. They want her to plead to misdemeanor vandalism with probation and restitution. What do you think? I think that's garbage. She committed a hate crime based on disability. She destroyed your property in retaliation for you asserting your civil rights. This should be a felony. The prosecutor agreed. They rejected the plea offer and moved forward to trial. But 2 weeks before the trial date, Patricia's attorney called the prosecutor with a new offer. Patricia would plead guilty to criminal damage to property as a felony, agree to pay full restitution including the cost of my rebuilt garden beds, accept a restraining order prohibiting her from coming within 100 yards of me or my property, and complete 200 hours of community service. The prosecutor called me before accepting. Mr. Jenkins, it's your property. What do you think? Will she have a felony conviction on her record? Yes, permanently. And the restraining order is enforceable, absolutely. If she violates it, she goes to jail. Then I'm okay with it. I just want this to be over. Patricia entered her guilty plea on a Tuesday morning in July. I attended the hearing with Monica. Patricia wouldn't look at me as the judge went through the formalities. When asked if she understood she was pleading guilty to a felony, she said yes in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask her to repeat herself. The civil lawsuit settled a month later. The HOA's insurance company, after reviewing the evidence and the HUD investigation findings, pressured the HOA to settle for $40,000. Patricia personally was on the hook for another $20,000. Her homeowner's insurance refused to cover it because it was an intentional act. She's going to have to sell her house, Monica told me. Between the legal fees and the settlement, she can't afford to stay there. I felt a twinge of guilt about that, but Monica shook her head. Don't. She did this to herself. Actions have consequences. The HUD investigation concluded with a formal finding that the HOA had violated the Fair Housing Act through disability discrimination and retaliation. The HOA was required to implement new policies and training for all board members. They had to send a formal letter to all residents explaining disability accommodation rights, and they were placed under HUD monitoring for 3 years. Patricia and her husband listed their house in September. It sold within 2 weeks to a nice couple from Chicago with 2 young kids. I introduced myself when they moved in and welcomed them to the neighborhood. The new HOA board, under Jennifer's leadership, was like night and day. They sent out a newsletter explaining residents' rights to reasonable accommodations. They revised the architectural review process to be more transparent and fair. And they instituted term limits for board positions so no one person could accumulate too much power. My garden beds thrived. The tomatoes produced so well that I was giving them away to neighbors. The peppers were perfect. My herbs grew lush and fragrant. Every morning I went out there with my coffee and tended to my plants, feeling grateful for the ability to do something I loved without pain. Tom installed a beautiful cedar pergola in his backyard and didn't get a single complaint. Susan Miller built a small accessible ramp to her front door for her aging mother who used a walker. The neighborhood felt different, friendlier, less fearful. One Saturday morning in October, I was harvesting the last of my tomatoes when my new neighbor from across the street, David Chen, walked over with his 2 kids. "Mr. Jenkins, I hope we're not bothering you, but my kids have been fascinated by your garden beds. Would you mind if they looked?" "Of course not. Come on over." The kids, a boy and girl around 7 and 9, walked around the beds with wide eyes. "Why are they so tall?" the girl asked. "Well, I hurt my back and bending over is really hard for me, but I love to garden. So I built these beds up high enough that I can work in them without bending. It's called accessible gardening." "That's really smart," the boy said. "My grandpa has a bad back too. Maybe he could build something like this." "He absolutely could. If you want, have your parents give him my number." "I'd be happy to talk to him about it." David smiled. "That would be great. My father-in-law has been really depressed since he had to give up his garden. This might be just what he needs." That afternoon, I got a call from Robert. "Gary, the HOA board has a proposal for you. We'd like to install a community-accessible garden area in the common space by the playground. Raised beds that anyone can use, with proper accessible height and wide paths for wheelchairs or walkers. Would you be willing to consult on the design?" "I'd love to." We broke ground on the community garden in November. 6 large raised beds, all built to ADA specifications, wide gravel paths, a small shed for tools, a bench where people could sit and rest. The board approved a budget for it, and multiple neighbors volunteered to help build. On a cold Saturday, about 20 of us worked together to construct the beds. Robert supervised the construction. Tom handled the plumbing for a water spigot. Frank, despite his age, was out there painting the tool shed. Even David's kids helped spread gravel on the paths. As I was working, Jennifer came over. "Gary, I want to thank you." "For what?" "For standing up to Patricia. For fighting back. I know it wasn't easy, but you changed this neighborhood for the better. Before all this, everyone was scared of the HOA, scared to do anything to their own homes. Now people feel like they can actually live here." "I just wanted to garden," I said. "I know. But you did more than that. You reminded us all that HOA rules are supposed to serve the community, not the other way around." The community garden was finished in early December, too late for fall planting but ready for spring. At the HOA holiday party, Jennifer presented me with a plaque that read, "Gary Jenkins, in appreciation for your service to our country and your advocacy for our community." The Oakwood Meadows Accessible Community Garden. I hung it in my living room next to my military commendations. Both represented fights worth having. In February, I got a notification that Patricia's criminal probation officer had contacted Monica. Patricia had violated her probation by failing to complete her community service hours and by missing restitution payments. A warrant was issued for her arrest. "Where is she?" I asked Monica. According to her attorney, she moved to Arizona with her husband. But Naperville PD has entered the warrant into the national system. If she gets pulled over or has any contact with police, she'll be arrested and extradited back to Illinois to face the probation violation charges. Does that affect the restitution she owes me? Eventually. The civil judgment is still enforceable. We can pursue collection actions regardless of where she lives. But honestly, Gary, she's probably judgment-proof at this point. She's spent everything on legal fees. I was surprisingly okay with that. The money had never been the point. Accountability was the point. Making sure she couldn't do to someone else what she tried to do to me was the point. Spring came early that year. In March, I started seeds in my garden beds: tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squash. I also planted herbs and flowers, making the beds not just functional but beautiful. The neighborhood response was overwhelmingly positive. People walking by would stop and compliment the garden. Some asked for advice on starting their own. The community garden became incredibly popular. 10 different families signed up for plots. An older veteran named Carl Morrison, who'd heard about the garden from David's father-in-law, took one of the plots and started growing beans and lettuce. We'd sit together some mornings, two old soldiers talking about vegetables and the weather and how good it felt to have dirt under our fingernails again. "I heard about what happened with your HOA lady," Carl said one morning. "Hell of a thing, but you handled it right. Can't let people like that run roughshod over you." I had good help, a good lawyer, neighbors who backed me up. Still took guts. I know guys who would have just torn the beds down and given up. I thought about it, I admitted, but I was tired of giving up things because my back is screwed up. I gave up playing with my nephews because I can't bend down to their level. I gave up hiking. I gave up a job I loved because I couldn't do the physical requirements anymore. I wasn't giving up gardening too, Carl nodded. That's the thing about disability. People who don't live with it don't understand. It's not about wanting special treatment. It's about wanting to do normal things like everyone else. In April, I got an email from HUD. James Walker, the investigator, wanted to know if I'd be willing to participate in a case study about disability discrimination in HOA communities. "Your case was textbook retaliation, and we think it would be valuable for training purposes. Obviously, all identifying information would be changed." I agreed. If my experience could help someone else navigate a similar situation, it was worth it. The legal fallout for the HOA continued. Their insurance premiums tripled because of the discrimination finding. Some residents grumbled about it, but most understood that Patricia's actions had caused the problem, not my complaint about those actions. The new board policies made a real difference. 2 other residents requested and received disability accommodations. One installed a wheelchair ramp. Another got approval for a medical alert system that required visible exterior equipment. Both requests were approved quickly and without argument. In June, I was harvesting tomatoes when I saw a Naperville police car pull up across the street. Detective Hunt got out and walked over. "Mr. Jenkins, thought you'd want to know. Patricia Whitmore was arrested in Phoenix yesterday. She got pulled over for speeding and the warrant popped up. Is she coming back to Illinois? She's fighting extradition, but she'll lose. Illinois will send someone to bring her back to face the probation violation charges. Given that she's been gone for months and made no effort to complete her community service or pay restitution, The judge will likely revoke probation and sentence her to jail time. How much time? Hard to say. Could be anywhere from 30 days to a year. The judge will look at the underlying offense and the extent of the probation violation. But she's going to serve some time, Mr. Jenkins. She's going to face real consequences. After Detective Hunt left, I sat on my back porch and looked at my garden beds. They were overflowing with life now. The tomato plants were 6 feet tall, heavy with fruit. The pepper plants were bushy and productive. Butterflies danced around the flowers I'd planted along the edges. Bees hummed contentedly as they worked. This was what I'd been fighting for. Not to win against Patricia, not to prove a point, just this. The ability to grow things, to nurture life, to spend my mornings with coffee and plants and dirt under my fingernails. To do something that brought me joy without pain. My phone rang. It was Monica. "Gary, I just got a call from Patricia's attorney. She wants to settle the remaining restitution. I thought she didn't have any money. She's selling her Arizona house." Actually, it sounds like she's getting divorced. Her husband is keeping the house and giving her a buyout. She wants to pay you the remaining $20,000 to close out the civil case completely. What do you recommend? Take it, get it in writing, get it done. Move on with your life. The settlement agreement was signed 2 weeks later. Patricia wired the money to Monica's trust account, and Monica cut me a check. I put most of it in savings, but I spent $2,000 on improvements to my garden beds. Better soil, a drip irrigation system, a small greenhouse attachment for starting seeds. Patricia was extradited back to Illinois in July. Her probation revocation hearing was set for August. Monica and I both attended. Patricia looked different, thinner, older. The fight had gone out of her. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she stood and apologized. It was brief and sounded rehearsed, but it was something. "Your Honor, I let my pride and my anger get the better of me. I damaged Mr. Jenkins's property because I was upset about losing control of the HOA board. I violated my probation because I was ashamed to face the consequences of my actions. I'm sorry." The judge sentenced her to 90 days in county jail with credit for time served during extradition. She'd serve about 60 more days. After her release, her probation would be reinstated for another year with strict compliance requirements. As they led her out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked at me. Not with anger this time, just resignation. A woman who'd let her need for control destroy her life. I didn't feel victorious. I felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that she'd made choices that had such devastating consequences. Sad that her unwillingness to show basic human decency and follow federal law had cost her so much. But I also felt relief. It was finally, truly over. The rest of that summer was peaceful. My garden produced more vegetables than I could possibly eat. I gave away bags of tomatoes and peppers to neighbors. I made salsa and sauce and froze them for winter. I taught David's kids how to identify different plants and how to check for ripeness. The community garden flourished. Carl's beans climbed their trellises. A young couple grew strawberries. An elderly woman named Grace planted nothing but flowers, creating a beautiful corner of color that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. In September, the HOA hosted a harvest festival in the common area. We had a potluck where everyone brought dishes made from their garden produce. There was a small farmer's market where people could trade and share. Kids ran around playing while adults sat in lawn chairs and talked. Jennifer made a speech thanking everyone who'd contributed to the community garden project. This space represents what HOA communities should be. Neighbors working together, supporting each other, making accommodations so everyone can participate. We're all better when we make room for everyone's needs. She didn't mention Patricia or the lawsuit or any of the ugliness from the previous year. She didn't need to. Everyone knew. And everyone understood that things were better now. As fall turned to winter, I started planning for the next growing season. I wanted to try some new tomato varieties, maybe some unusual peppers, definitely more herbs. I sketched out garden layouts and ordered seeds. On a cold December morning, I was sitting in my living room looking out at my snow-covered garden beds when my phone rang. It was James Walker from HUD. Mr. Jenkins, I wanted to let you know that the case study using your situation has been completed. It's being used in training for HUD investigators and for HOA board members around the country. Your willingness to fight back and document everything has helped create better protections for people with disabilities in HOA communities. That's good to hear. I also wanted to tell you that your case prompted a review of HOA regulations in Illinois. The state legislature is considering a bill that would explicitly require HOAs to provide reasonable accommodations for disabilities and would increase penalties for retaliation. Your case is being cited in the legislative history. After we hung up, I thought about that. My garden beds, built because I needed to garden without pain, had become part of something bigger, a push for better protections, better understanding, better community. The next spring came with unusual warmth. I started planting early and everything grew beautifully. My garden beds were more productive than ever. The community garden expanded, adding 4 more beds to meet demand. One Saturday in May, a young couple came to the community garden looking lost. I walked over. "Can I help you find something?" "We're looking for Gary Jenkins," the woman said. "We were told he's the person who started this garden." "That's me." "I'm Heather Hayes," she said. "My husband and I just bought a house 3 streets over. I use a wheelchair and I've always wanted to garden but couldn't figure out how to make it work. Someone told us about this community garden and about your raised beds." I spent an hour showing her around, explaining the accessible height, the wide paths, how the raised beds put everything within reach from a wheelchair. Her face lit up with excitement. "This is amazing. I can actually do this." "You absolutely can. Let me show you some tricks for making it even easier." Heather became a regular at the community garden. She grew cherry tomatoes and herbs, working from her wheelchair at the accessible beds. Watching her tend her plants, seeing the joy on her face, reminded me why all the fighting and frustration had been worth it. 2 years after I'd first installed my garden beds, the Oakwood Meadows HOA won a national award from the Fair Housing Accessibility Council for their community accessible garden and their model disability accommodation policies. Jennifer accepted the award at a ceremony in Washington, D.C., and brought back a plaque for the community center. "This is really Gary's award," she said at the HOA meeting where she presented the plaque. "He's the one who forced us to be better, to think about accessibility, to understand that accommodations aren't special treatment, they're basic fairness." I stood and shook my head. The credit goes to everyone here, to Robert and Tom and Frank who stood up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, to all the neighbors who helped rebuild my beds when they were destroyed, to this board for implementing real changes. This is what community is supposed to look like. The applause was genuine and warm. After the meeting, at least a dozen people came up to thank me or share their own stories about dealing with disabilities or accessibility issues. One man told me about his daughter who had autism and needed certain environmental accommodations. Another woman talked about her son with dyslexia who needed extra time on the community pool's swim test. "Before all this happened with you, I would have been too scared to ask for any of that," she said. But now I know the HOA will work with us, not against us. That was the real victory. Not beating Patricia in court, not getting compensation for my destroyed property, but changing the culture of the community to one where people felt safe asking for what they needed. In late summer of that year, I got one final letter regarding Patricia. Her probation had been successfully completed. She'd finished her community service, paid all her restitution, and attended court-ordered counseling. Her attorney wanted me to know that she was living in New Mexico now, working as a medical billing clerk, and had no plans to return to Illinois. She wanted me to tell you that she hopes you're doing well, the letter said. She's undergone significant personal growth and understands that her actions were wrong. I filed the letter away. I didn't need her apology or her well wishes. I'd moved on. My garden beds, now 3 years old, were still going strong. The cedar had weathered to a beautiful silver gray. The soil was rich and healthy. Every spring they came alive with new growth, and every summer they produced abundantly. I'd added a 4th bed that year, this one dedicated entirely to flowers for the bees and butterflies. Native wildflowers that bloomed from early spring through late fall, providing habitat and food for pollinators. It was my way of giving back to the ecosystem that made my vegetable garden possible. One cool October evening, I was closing up the garden for the season, pulling out spent tomato plants and preparing the beds for winter, when Carl came over from the community garden. "Gary, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" I wanted to say thanks. I know I've said it before, but I mean it. This garden, what you fought for, it gave me something to live for. After I retired, after my wife passed, I was just sitting in my house waiting to die. Now I've got a reason to get up in the morning. I've got purpose. His eyes were wet and I felt my own throat tighten. "Carl, you don't need to thank me." "Yeah, I do. You could have given up, could have torn down those beds and avoided the whole mess. But you didn't. You fought. And because you fought, guys like me get to have this." We stood there in the fading light, 2 veterans, connected by plants and soil and the simple act of growing things. "Well," I said finally, "someone's got to make sure the tomatoes get planted every year." Carl laughed. "Damn right." As I write this now, 5 years after I first installed those controversial garden beds, I'm sitting on my back porch with my morning coffee, looking out at my thriving garden. The beds are still there, still at 30 inches, still perfectly suited for my needs. They've been joined by others in the neighborhood. At least 8 other households have installed raised beds of various heights. The community garden has doubled in size. 24 beds now, with a waiting list. The space has become a gathering place, especially in the mornings when the gardeners come out to tend their plots. There's a sense of community there that didn't exist before. The HOA, under Jennifer's continued leadership, has become a model for accessibility and reasonable accommodations. They've been profiled in housing magazines and consulted by other HOAs trying to improve their practices. And me. I'm still here, still gardening, still grateful for the ability to grow things without pain. Every tomato I harvest, every pepper I pick, every herb I clip reminds me that fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, is always worth it. My raised garden beds weren't just about gardening. They were about dignity. About the right to modify my own property to accommodate my disability. About refusing to be bullied into giving up something that brought me joy. They were also about community. About neighbors standing together. About changing systems that don't work. About making space for everyone, regardless of ability. The ADA guidelines require a 30-inch height for accessible gardening for good reason. That height allows people with mobility issues, people who can't bend, people in wheelchairs, to participate in an activity that's therapeutic, productive, and joyful. Patricia didn't understand that. She saw rules and aesthetics and property values. But property values aren't just about how things look. They're about how communities function. A neighborhood where everyone feels welcome, where accommodations are made, where people support each other, that's a valuable place to live. That's a place worth fighting for. So if you're reading this and you're facing a similar situation with your HOA, know this. You have rights. Federal law protects your ability to make reasonable accommodations for your disability. Document everything. Get legal help. Don't back down. And if you're on an HOA board and someone requests an accommodation, listen. Ask for documentation if needed, but approach it with empathy and a genuine desire to help, not to obstruct. The laws protecting people with disabilities exist for good reasons. Work with them, not against them. As for me, I'm already planning next year's garden. I'm thinking about trying some heirloom tomatoes I've never grown before. Maybe some hot peppers for making hot sauce. Definitely more flowers for the pollinators. My raised garden beds will be here at exactly 30 inches high, ADA compliant and perfect for my needs. They'll be here because I fought for them, because good neighbors supported me, because federal law protected my rights. And because sometimes, standing up for yourself creates change that helps everyone. The tomatoes taste sweeter knowing that.